I'm Richard Paradise, Executive Director of the Martha's Vineyard Film Society here at the Martha's Vineyard Film Center, and we're really happy to have you joining us for the third of 4 Science on Screen programs this year, funded by the Sloan Foundation grant and administered through the Coolidge Corner Cinema in Boston. We're really happy to have you here for our screening of Dinosaur 13 and our special guest, Zachary Morris. Zach is a Ph.D. candidate at Harvard University in their Organismic and Evolutionary Biology department. Now, you said that word is not really a real word, but it's a good sounding word, but it's also, I should say that it combines the sciences of paleontology with biology to look at early dinosaurs and early evolutions of life on the planet Earth. And so we're really happy to have Zachary here as a presenter to talk about his studies, the science of paleontology, and sort of hopefully dovetail it a little bit into this movie, Dinosaur 13, which is about the discovery of the most complete T-Rex skeleton ever found in the U.S., maybe in the Earth. And it was found in 1990 by Peter Lawson, a paleontologist. And so we're going to find out about Peter, his team, and the story that unfolded after the discovery of this dinosaur. But we'd like to welcome up Zachary Morris, and on with the show. Yes.
All right. Is this on now? All right. Thank you, Richard, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all about one of my favorite topics. As Richard said, I'm a vertebrate
It's on.
It's just really quiet. Here, I'll just hold it then. The stand's not working. I'll just hold it then. So as Richard said, I'm Zachary Morris. I'm a vertebrate paleontologist and evolutionary developmental biologist at Harvard. And my dissertation is mostly focused on the evolution of crocodilians as opposed to birds and dinosaurs. But I'm going to show you today, I think, a lot of how paleontology is done today and the fact that it's not just old bones. So when I say paleontology, I want you all to think about the first image that comes to mind. Now, is it a fossil or a museum display like one of these things, or even maybe a giant dinosaur like one of the ones in the center? For me, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of paleontology is actually a place like this, a room full of rows and rows of cabinets containing specimens from millions of years ago for researchers to study. And it's actually in collection spaces like this and offices back behind the public galleries where most of the work really occurs for paleontologists. But in preparing for this talk, I tried to get to what the true essence of paleontology is. And when I think about it, it is something like this, or a place like this. You know, paleontologists have an amazing opportunity to explore beautiful expanses full of amazing colors and even more beautiful, but especially in this picture, harder to spot fossils. This is actually a shot from Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, where I was lucky enough to work over the summer before I started my Ph.D. program at Harvard. And this region in particular is actually known as the Painted Desert because of the beautiful colors of all the rock layers. And just to rub it in one tiny bit more that I have the best job in the world, here's a close-up of some of those rocks, and you can see these amazing blues and purples and gray greens. And then a close-up of these huge petrified logs that give the park its name with some students for scale. But how do paleontologists actually find fossils? How do we actually perform our science? And as I said just a moment ago, most of the work in paleontological research doesn't actually happen in the field, even if that's maybe the most fun part. The first step, well before you even think about stepping foot in the field, is to do a lot of planning and research. We spend a lot of time reading papers and doing research into what people have found previously, where fossils have been found, and particularly going to the map room and looking at geologic maps. So if you're not familiar, here's a geologic map of Massachusetts. And all of these different colors represent different layers of rock and different periods of time that are recorded in the geologic history of this particular area. And if you're interested in finding a particular type of fossil, or you're interested in dinosaurs versus crocodilians or ancient amphibious tetrapods, the age of the rock and the type of environment that you want to look in is going to be different. And so we spend a lot of time combing through maps, field notes, field reports, and published research to allow us to put together a plan of where we're actually likely to find fossils that we're interested in. We don't just go out blind, willy-nilly, hoping to find something. Once we have an idea of where we want to go, we still need to ask ourselves several important questions before we start packing up the trucks. And some of these important questions are things like, who owns the land? Is it public or private? Do we need permits or landowner permission to go on the property or to excavate things? And it's absolutely critical that we figure out the answers to these questions before we even go in the field, so that way we know that there's a plan for where the fossils are going to be kept, where they're going to be prepared and housed, and then we know that they're going to be maintained, especially for fossils that are on public lands, for all of the citizenry to be able to have access to them for research and aesthetic purposes. All right, so now that busy work to a certain extent is out of the way, and we are finally in the fun part where we can talk about going in the field. And in this profession, you definitely have to love long walks on the beach, even if it's a fossil beach or a floodplain of a prehistoric environment, like you see here. And this is actually a shot you see in the corner. Colleagues and I have stopped to orient ourselves before walking further out into the Badlands to locate decades-old fossil localities in northern Arizona. And you can see looking out here that this isn't the most hospitable place to be. You know, it's difficult terrain. Even getting out to where we're standing now took hours of driving in four-wheel drive vehicles and hiking down a steep cliff that's back behind me when I took this photo that you can't even see. And then we have still to travel this huge expanse below us. So you need to have the right equipment in terms of clothing and, you know, appropriate footwear and sunscreen and all that stuff. Obviously lots of water and snacks. But as we'll get to in a moment, not all of the water that you need to bring in the field is just for drinking. And fossils are not always, you know, where you necessarily want to look. Sometimes they're up at the top of hills or mountains and require climbing up and to the top of things. Other times you find them exposed by recent flooding and seasonal riverbeds. Sometimes they're under huge layers of concrete-like rocks. That my colleague up there next to me, Adam Marsh, actually did work in Montana that required digging holes and using dynamite to explode off big chunks of rock conglomerate in order to actually get down to the fossiliferous layers. So you need to be prepared to go where the fossils are. And this requires what's known as prospecting. When you don't know where you're going to find fossils, you need to be looking for them. And it takes a while to get an eye for this. Basically, when we're prospecting for fossils, we're walking around, looking out in front of us, a few feet to, you know, dozens of meters in front of us, looking for any hint, any signal that could mean that there's a fossil that isn't just a rock. So things like a change in the reflectance of light off of it, something that suggests that there's a different texture, something that just kind of gives you that hint. And it takes a lot of time and spending time in the particular location to really get an eye for that. It's not a thing that you can just pick up. And if I were to go to a different part of the world, it wouldn't just come to me immediately, myself even. And just as an anecdote, if you are in the field and you're feeling in the spirit, you think you found a fossil, there's an old, tried and true method for testing it. It's the lick test. If you may not be aware of this, but fossils, particularly those of vertebrate bone, are full of lots of little tiny holes. They're very porous. And so if you actually stick them to something wet like your tongue, they stick. They don't just like get wet, they actually stick to your tongue the way that a rock wouldn't. So you can use that as a ballpark for whether or not you think you actually have a fossil. All right, so we found a fossil. Maybe you've licked it. Now what? Well, the first thing that we need to know once you've found a fossil is, as I said at the top, is it float or is it in situ? So what I mean by float is it just on the surface? Is it something that's been preserved for millions of years in a rock layer and then through erosion come to the surface and been separated from whatever else was there, and it's just an isolated element on the surface? You can see here in this picture I'm holding this little tiny nub of bone that I've blown up there for you. And we spent actually close to 20 minutes looking around after we found this thing on the surface and actually dug into the hill, even though there wasn't anything suggesting that there was more of this, to see if we could find more, because this little nub, even though it may not look like much, is actually the part of a leg bone from a close relative of dinosaurs back before dinosaurs did any of the interesting things that they do. And this was actually only the second known occurrence of this type of animal from petrified forest when we found it. But in comparison, my colleague on the right here has exposed a larger part. You can see the texture in there. This is actually a part of the shoulder girdle of a giant amphibious tetrapod from the Triassic. And if you look at it, you can see that it's deeply in the rock. It's not just something that's on the surface, and it actually requires more complex excavation in order to figure out what it is and take it back. And in this image, you can also see some of the tools that we use when we're doing these sorts of excavations. So you can see she's holding a brush for brushing off the surface. In the background, we have awls and picks for digging in and breaking up rock and more carefully removing layers. And then that plastic bottle over there is actually contains what we call a plastic consolidant or a stabilizer. So it's actually plastic beads dissolved in acetone that we can use to stabilize with a thin layer of plastic the bone so that it doesn't separate and come apart. But it's also reversible. We can put more acetone on it and the plastic goes away. It's not a permanent glue. But when we're excavating fossils, like this skull that you can just barely see the outline of here, the goal isn't actually to just dig it up and take it out and put it on the bed of the truck and drive it back. It does depend on the particular location, but generally speaking, fossils are very fragile, right? They've been surviving in these rocks for millions of years. They're probably broken, and the rock around them has actually been stabilizing them in place. And so to actually prevent further damage or loss of the material, we don't actually want to excavate and expose the entire surface of the specimen. What we use our tools for is to find the edges, to find where the specimen ends, and to dig around it and actually try and keep a fair amount of the rock in contact with the bone because it's stabilizing it. And then we'll actually make a protective coating or a jacket on top of that rock and the specimen and take it back into the museum where we can do more controlled preparation on it. So here's a shot of my colleagues and I in the field making some plaster jackets. You can see one in the front here that's already finished and one that we're working on. And you'll see that we also have a bunch of tools around, but we also have toilet paper and lots of water bottles. And this is what I mentioned earlier. That water and the toilet paper aren't for our own relief. This is what we actually use in making these jackets. So it may seem kind of strange, but toilet paper is actually a perfect boundary layer to protect the rock and the fossil from the plaster. We're going to make this hard, rigid plaster basically just like a cast that you would put on your arm if it's broken. But if you get that on the specimen, it's not coming off without damaging the specimen. So we actually take toilet paper and take a wet brush and kind of build this layer up on top of the rock and the fossil to protect it, because that we can remove from the specimen. This is what we use. Other people you'll find will use aluminum foil or another type of separating layer. And then we'll take fabric, often burlap. At PFO, we've often gotten into the habit of using kind of an insulative foam that will then mix in with the plaster and then place strips around the specimen to make this rigid but flexible jacket on top of the toilet paper. So when we're finished, they look something like this. And once you let them finish curing, which is what it's actually doing, because when you mix plaster with water, it's a chemical reaction. It's not just getting wet and drying. It will provide a strong, rigid layer that's reinforced by that flexibility of the fabric so that this won't be damaged when we transport it back into the lab. So when we get it back into the lab, we can finally open it up and begin the process of carefully, laboriously preparing the specimen out. And you can see here we use microscopes so that we can get really detailed views of the specimen so that we know that we're not damaging it. We'll use fine tools like dental picks and brushes. And then up in the top right, that's actually a little handheld jackhammer, essentially. It's a little pneumatic awl that will very quickly abrade rock from the surface of the bone. And you can see in this panel down here that we've begun the process of exposing a little bit of the fossil. There's a little tooth that you can see, and this is basically the roof of the mouth of this prehistoric animal. And over days and weeks of preparation, the specimen begins to come into view, and you begin to appreciate all the work that we did caring for the specimen in the field and not doing that work, in the field, because now we have a beautiful specimen that's fully intact. This is the skull of an animal that's called a phytosaur, which is actually the sister to birds and crocodiles. And it basically does what modern crocodiles do for a living millions and millions of years before crocodiles even thought about doing it. So technically, crocodiles are mimicking these guys. So now we've done all this beautiful prep work, and now it's ready to go into the collections, be cataloged and studied, or even put on display for people to appreciate. And so here's my short digression about Sue specifically, seeing as how tonight's film is about this arguably the most complete Tyrannosaur, almost certainly. And I think that it's a good example of why the steps that I've laid out, the process that we go through, is critically important. Right? Obviously, the team that collected Sue did a tremendous job in preserving and preparation and stabilizing the specimen, since it's a lot of work. Right? There's a lot of material to deal with here. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds, since the movie will go into it and there's a lot to say about it, and I only have so much time. But I think it's important to mention that a perspective that's put forward in the film is that things like federal regulations that require permitting for collections potentially slow down the process of paleontology and the science as itself as it progresses. And I actually think that that's not really the case. And the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, which is an international society of academic and non-academic, business and non-business people who are interested in paleontology, actually released a statement that you can read in full, but part of it specifically states that the federal permitting process helps ensure that field collecting is well planned and professionally conducted, that the scientific context of specimens is documented, we know where they came from, what layers, and that data in association with the fossil isn't being lost, and that the fossil is being placed in a research repository that has demonstrated commitment to preserving them in perpetuity for scientific research and public enjoyment. Right? This is obviously hugely important for public land fossils, because those are all owned by all of us. Right? They're not just for a private collector. But now with that little digression, I want to get back to talking about what the fossil record can teach us. And so obviously the fossil record, everything that we found so far has taught us a lot about life on this planet. And it's the only real insight we have into deep geologic time. You know, the hundreds of millions of years of life on this planet, almost everything, 99% of all life has gone extinct. And this is the only way that we have any way of understanding what was there. You know, it records when and how different types of animals come into being and go extinct, when and where the living groups, the things that are around today, originated, and also that there are several mass extinction events, these big periods where huge swaths of the ecosystem are wiped out and there's a complete restructuring of how life happens, and we would have no idea if we were only looking at modern forms that any of these things had happened. You know, it also teaches us a lot about anatomy. You know, we wouldn't have anticipated animals like iguanodon with their weird thumb spikes standing up on their hind limbs would ever have existed were it not for the fossil record. And it also reveals important transitions, right? So the evolution of bird wings from dinosaur arms is well documented in the fossil record, and we can see how birds evolved flight through this process. And it's rare, but occasionally we do get records of actual behavior. You know, we have things like feeding and combat, and even brooding behaviors of this oviraptor sitting on its nest. But the fossil record doesn't preserve everything. It's not very good at preserving soft parts. Animals that don't have hard skeletons don't have great fossil records. We don't know as much about them. DNA breaks down relatively quickly, so we can't very often do anything about it. And embryonic development, things that are happening in the egg, these animals barely have skeletons, so it's really unlikely that we actually see them. But sometimes we are very lucky. We do have fossils, and more every day, particularly out of Chinese localities that preserve soft tissue like gut contents and feathers. There's actually insects preserved in amber that have DNA that's been sequenced and compared with modern forms. And we do occasionally get clutches of eggs that show how anatomical development is happening and itself evolves. But paleontologists are interested in addressing questions beyond just what's happening to the hard parts. So we integrate the study of living animals with those of fossils to provide insight into these missing gaps in the fossil record. And I myself am actually what's known as an evolutionary developmental biology researcher, which means I'm interested in how the process of development, going from a single-celled embryo to an adult, how that process itself evolves through time. And so to answer questions about how development evolves, I integrate analyses of shape. So here's a skull of an alligator with dots on it that show points where you can compare how the shape of the skull changes as this animal develops and how that relates to the evolution of this group. And then I also integrate this with studies of the developmental genetics of living species. So here in this central panel, this is an experiment that shows where particular developmental genes are turned on. Everywhere where you see purple coloring, that's an important gene that's active at that point in development. And you take these two data sets and integrate them with our understanding of the evolution and the fossil record, and we can begin to make hypotheses about how development itself has evolved through time. Now, it's kind of strange in a vacuum, but I think an example will make this clearer. So I want to talk about the evolution of the bird beak really quickly. The bird beak, everyone knows what it is. It's a thing that is very unique to birds, and it's anatomically very unique. In birds, you have this single enlarged bone at the front of the face. It's called the premaxilla that makes up the bulk of the beak. But if you look at the front of the faces of things like alligators and turtles, that bone is actually two separate bones, and they're small and they're curved, very different than what you see in birds. And if you look at the evolution and you compare mammals and reptiles and birds, you see that it's really just within birds that we have this weird fused bone. And that includes when you compare it with things like dinosaurs and even things like Archaeopteryx, which still have these little tiny two bones at the front of the face instead of a beak, which is maybe not too surprising since Archaeopteryx still has teeth even. So we know that there's this interesting anatomical difference, but does this potentially relate to developmental differences? So to address this, colleagues and I actually studied the developmental genetics of a large number of these different animals, and what we found is displayed in this figure. And I know that it's a lot to take in, but if you look at the top panels on the left for turtle and alligator, you can see that there's purple patches that are paired on either side of the face, and they're little tiny curved purple patches. Whereas if you look at the birds, you can see that there's purple that continues all the way through to the center of the face. This central region of these genes being turned on seems to correlate with this expanded bone that we see in birds. And when you look at the phylogeny of gene expression in these different animals, you can see that it's only birds that have this unique central gene expression pattern. So we hypothesized that the evolution of this central gene expression pattern was critical to the evolution of the beak. And to test that, we actually modified the developmental patterns of developing chickens to see if that specific developmental change could give you a face or a beak. And so in the center here, if you compare this, where it says left 1, we have control, weak and strong experimental conditions in alligator. And you'll see that in the control, right, we have that midline expression, that purple in the center. But we lose that when we took little tiny silica beads that are soaked in chemicals that inhibit the expression of those genes. And what's fascinating is if you look at the skeletons underneath, when we disrupt that gene expression in the center, not only do we get the ancestral gene expression pattern, we actually get a face that looks more like an alligator or an ancestral dinosaur face instead of the bird beak. So this suggests strongly that birds, by modifying and repurposing these developmental genes, by expanding where these genes are turned on, have managed to repurpose an existing developmental toolkit to derive their highly recognizable beak. But very quickly, Evo-Devo, what I do, is only one way in which paleontology is pushing forward outside of just old bones. There are people who are studying muscular anatomy and looking at how muscles move animals by reconstructing where muscles attach and how they can potentially move in these extinct animals. And there are even labs over all around the world who are interested in looking at how is DNA preserved in fossils? How old do fossils get before they completely lack DNA, and what can we learn from that? And so I hope that with this, you can begin to see how amazing and new the field of paleontology is, even if it does start with some pretty old bones. And I have to thank all of these people for their help with my various projects, the organizers for tonight, and this film series for inviting me, and for all of you being here tonight. And I'd love to take any questions now or in the future. Feel free to reach out. Thank you.